Commercial transport aircraft have to carry certain safety and survival equipment for the protection of their crew and passengers during emergencies. This lesson will outline the requirements for the carriage and location of oxygen, life jackets, life rafts and safety equipment in accordance with EU OPS requirements. EU OPS states that an operator shall not operate a pressurized aeroplane at pressure altitudes above 10,000 feet unless supplemental oxygen is stored and can be dispensed when required in an emergency. The oxygen supply need is subdivided into three groups: the flight deck crew, the cabin crew and the passengers. In the event of a loss of pressurization, the cabin altitude will rise rapidly and the flight deck crew will need to resort to an emergency oxygen supply in order to operate safely and efficiently to resolve the problem. The loss of cabin altitude will require the pilot to carry out an emergency descent to a lower level, ideally 10,000 feet or to the minimum safe altitude if higher. The minimum requirements for the supply of supplemental oxygen for all occupants of the flight deck on duty are a little complex and we are required to learn them. The supply must be available for any time longer than 30 minutes that the cabin altitude is between 10,000 feet and 13,000 feet, and for the entire flight time when the cabin pressure exceeds 13,000 feet. In addition, if the aeroplane is certificated to operate to 25,000 feet and below, the absolute minimum supply is 30 minutes followed by 20 minutes at 10,000 feet. And if certificated to operate above 25,000 feet, an absolute minimum of 2 hours followed by 110 minutes at 10,000 feet. The requirements for operating above and below 25,000 feet include 10 minutes of oxygen needed during the emergency descent to 10,000 feet. The cabin crew's oxygen supply requirement is similar to the flight crew's, but without the minima related to aircraft certification. The absolute minimum supply of oxygen for cabin crew is the quantity needed for a constant rate of descent from maximum operating altitude to 10,000 feet, followed by 20 minutes at 10,000 feet. The minimum oxygen supply for passengers is split into three percentage amounts governed by the cabin pressure altitude. The first requirement is sufficient oxygen to be available for 10% of the passengers for the entire flight time when the cabin exceeds 10,000 feet but does not exceed 14,000 feet. The next requirement is that for the entire flight time when the cabin pressure altitude exceeds 14,000 feet but does not exceed 15,000 feet, there must be enough oxygen based on 30% of the passengers. The last requirement is that for the entire flight time when the cabin pressure altitude exceeds 15,000 feet, there must be sufficient oxygen for all of the passengers with an absolute minimum supply for 10 minutes. For unpressurized aircraft, where the cabin pressure altitude is the same as that of the aircraft and cruising levels are necessarily much lower, the requirements are rather simpler. For flight deck crew, oxygen is required for any flight above 10,000 feet. For cabin crew, oxygen is required for any time spent above 13,000 feet, and at all times longer than 30 minutes above 10,000 feet. For passengers, all must have oxygen for any time spent above 13,000 feet, and there must be sufficient oxygen for 10% of the passengers above 10,000 feet. As well as oxygen for use at high cabin altitudes, all aircraft, pressurized or unpressurized, with a maximum takeoff mass of over 5,700 kilos, or with more than 19 passenger seats, must carry equipment to obviate the effects of smoke and fumes and allow the crew to carry out their duties. This is known as protective breathing equipment, or PBE, or more colloquially as the smoke hood. The requirement for each flight crew member is for a quick don PBE set to protect eyes, nose and mouth, allowing two-way communications with not less than 15 minutes oxygen supply when worn in an emergency. If the flight crew is more than one, but with no cabin crew, then one of the sets must be portable. On screen is an example of a PBE with instructions for use. You are not required to learn the instructions. For each cabin crew member, there must be a PBE set with 15 minutes oxygen located adjacent to the appropriate duty station. Any additional PBE sets should be located adjacent to the required portable fire extinguishers, and for a cargo compartment must be stowed outside the compartment adjacent to the entrance. When aircraft carry out flights over water and therefore face the possibility of ditching, EU OPS regulations apply regarding the carriage of life jackets and life or slide rafts. Life jackets, or alternative flotation devices, must be available for every person on board, located in a readily accessible stowage within reach of crew and passenger seats. For a single-engine aeroplane, any flight out of gliding range of shore would qualify, and for a multi-engine aeroplane, any flight more than 50 nautical miles from the shore. For longer range flights over water, it is necessary to carry life rafts or slide rafts with sufficient capacity to carry all persons on board the aeroplane, with a spare of the highest capacity life or slide raft. Qualifying flights in this case would be, for a single-engine aeroplane, any flight over water more than either 30 minutes or 100 nautical miles away from shore, whichever is less. And for multi-engined aeroplanes flying over water, the time or distance is the lesser of 2 hours at cruise speed or 400 nautical miles. Life rafts are to be stowed ready for use in an emergency and must be fitted with survival equipment and for making distress signals, and with water or means of containing and purifying water and basic food. Aircraft registered after the 1st of January 2002 are required to be fitted with an emergency locator transmitter, usually referred to as an ELT, capable of transmitting on the VHF emergency frequency of 121.5 MHz and the Search and Rescue Satellite, or SARSAT, data uplink frequency of 406 MHz. The beacon is operated by pulling on a toggle which will release the aerial and start transmission. Aircraft which operate in remote areas or where search and rescue (SAR) would be difficult, for example polar regions, desert or jungle, must be equipped with at least one ELT and signalling equipment to make the pyrotechnic signals described in the ICAO Annex 2. Other survival equipment appropriate to routes to be flown may also be required. In this lesson, we have studied the requirements for the carriage and location of safety equipment in accordance with EU OPS regulations. We looked at the requirements for the carriage of supplemental oxygen for crew and passengers in both pressurized and unpressurized aeroplanes, and the need for survival equipment such as life jackets and life or slide rafts, including emergency locator transmitters.